We'll try that again. Welcome to Jedi Talk number 2. This is the second in the series of in a 3 series of talks in partnership between AIA Tennessee, NOMA Nashville, and NOMA Memphis. This session will be recorded, so you can listen to it after the live session as well. My name is Linda Marziallo. I am AIA Vice President, AIA Tennessee, and also chair of the J+EDI Committee for AIA Tennessee. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speaker. This is Ingrid Cochran. Ingrid graduated from TSU with a bachelor's in psychology and from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College with a master's of education in child studies. Ingrid specializes in creating equitable and inclusive institutions, collective impacts, and grassroots movements. Utilizing her knowledge of stress, trauma, human development, and personality, Ingrid has been able to translate research concerning diversity, equity, inclusion, and trauma-informed practices into workplace and organizational solutions that suit both traditional and virtual teams. So with this, I'd like to welcome Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I hope everyone can hear me. Just like before, I want to give a disclaimer about my 2-year-old and my big dog, so you might hear them. And so thank you again for having me, and we will just jump right in. I want to take about hopefully 7 minutes to go through a process that's going to allow us to assess our own biases. So if you have the capacity to access this website, I want you to go to this site and take an assessment. It should say take a test. There might be a button that says take a test. And you will have many options. The one that you want to take is Race IAT, Race IAT. You can do this on your desktop, you can do it on your phone, you can do it on a tablet. If you are unable to do this right now, that's totally fine. Feel free to do it at your leisure. If you've done it before recently, you don't have to do it again unless you forgot. This assessment is pretty quick, so let's take about 7 minutes, and then I'll get started, and we'll jump into the rest of the presentation. For those of you who might have issues around being able to access it, no worries. Again, if you have any questions or if you can't access or you have issues with being able to complete the assessment, this site will be included in your resources once the series is completed, and you can always go in and do this. As you have questions, Ashley, please let me know if questions come up about accessing the site in the chat. While you guys are completing that, let me give you a little bit of housekeeping. Feel free as we move forward in this session to use the chat for questions, interactions, sharing resources, just like before. I also want to give a disclaimer that we will do a little bit of a review of the last time, so some of the information will be a repeat. And so again, we'll give about 6 more minutes to take this assessment. Unfortunately, I don't have elevator music for you. Another disclaimer is that this assessment is not exactly comfortable to take, but I do challenge you to complete it.
Ingrid, do you mind posting the link on the chat? Whenever I pull it up, it looks differently on my phone. I want to make sure I'm sending the right thing out.
And like I said before, I understand that we may not all complete this before we get started, especially as we have new people coming in. So feel free to attempt to complete the assessment. Again, it takes about 5 to 7 minutes, depending on how quick you are with your fingers. And then we'll get ready and get started, and you can definitely listen in while you complete it, or hold off and complete it at another time.
Ingrid, can you clarify which test it is again?
It's the race IAT.
Okay.
For those of you who have completed it, feel free to type in the chat that you're done. Give me a bit of a gauge of who has been able to complete this. Okay, we are going to start transitioning into today's discussion. Again, if you're in the middle of the assessment, just keep going. And if you have not started or haven't, or you're nowhere near completed yet, just be sure to keep this as a resource. And if you are interested in understanding bias as it relates to race, and plenty of other options there as well on the Harvard site. But this is an assessment that has been around since the 80s and has collected a lot of data on our individual biases here in America. This site is very comprehensive and has a lot of information about the data it has collected. So if you're interested in, where America sits along the lines of race, gender, and a host of other attributes, feel free to check it out. It's a very interesting site. And so this is going to be a continuation of the discussion that we started last time. When in our last session, we really focused on how did we get to the state that we are in when it comes to systemic and institutional racism as a country. However, today is going to be a little bit more interactive, and we're going to focus on the state of the field when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and then quickly move into what it looks like to address this issue within your field and your organizations and your firms. And so today is going to be much more interactive than the last session. Just a reminder, we still have our third session, which is coming up. It is the promise of diversity, equity, inclusion, and that one drawing together the past, the present, and the future as it concerns diversity, equity, inclusion within architecture. Today, we're going to look at how historical trauma and institutional racism has impacted the field, mostly through demographics. Then we'll define trauma-informed practices, which is really the central practice to address racism, sexism, all of the isms within organizations, because trauma-informed practices addresses all types of trauma. And as our conversation in the last session highlighted, trauma is at the root of the issues that we have around racism. And then outline some best practices for mitigating institutional racism within AIA. So some key terms, and this is going to be a bit of a review. Again, what is race? Again, what we talked about in the last session was really focused on race as a social construct, basically a means to stratify power. This is further illustrated in critical race theory, which we also discussed, which just outlines that white supremacy is deeply embedded within our society, that racism should be viewed as institutional, not individual. That our power structure was built to marginalize people of color, and it is working as it's supposed to work. And then race is a social construct, a tool to stratify power, so not so much genetic, but more so social. This goes against our beliefs as a nation. We tend to believe in American exceptionalism. So without getting too political, just the idea that when we look at history, that it's aspirational. This is problematic in that history should be critically analyzed and taken at face value, as opposed to having an aspirational lean. Us seeing history as aspirational allows us to have these types of stereotypical roles, like the white savior complex, or our beliefs in things like genetic Blackness, which would be that groups of color are experiencing things like an overrepresentation of poverty, and lack of educational achievement because there's some type of genetic racial component that makes it so, as opposed to the systems of racism that exist in this country. And so we definitely want to use critical race theory to frame our discussions today. Of course, bias is something to consider, that we just need to be aware that we all have bias. Explicit, the ways that we interact or are biased or racist or sexist in ways that we are aware of, and then implicit in the ways that we are unaware of. Again, our brains are huge organs that take up a lot of energy, and we have, as human beings, created shortcuts as a way to make decisions. Our shortcuts are deeply entrenched in our experiences and the information that we get from society. So as we make decisions, we often rely on our bias as a way to have this shortcut. And whenever we do so, we tend to make decisions that are based on the overarching values and beliefs in our environment. And in our environment, our belief is that white is better than other groups, that male is better than other groups. And so we have to push back on our biases actively, which means, of course, that we need to know what they are. And so as you assess your own bias, hopefully it brings it from the unaware to the aware, from the unconscious to the conscious. And once you have an understanding of your bias on a conscious level, then you can work to push back against it. Obviously, racism and institutional racism, we want to frame our discussions that racism is essentially believing in the superiority of a particular race, but then also believing that race is a fundamental determinant of abilities, of capabilities, of traits. And again, critical race theory and the research that we have concerning race rebukes that. Institutional racism, this is systemic oppression. And so it is often based on economic and political advantage. And then equality versus equity. We tend to push for equality when equity is needed. And so we have groups who have been wronged over centuries and require a lot more than other groups in present day. If we believe in equality, then that's everyone getting the same piece of the pie. However, we won't be able to move forward in equality until we have equity, until we get all groups to a certain level so that we can move forward in equality. And so this looks like people getting what they need. This looks like righting historical wrongs. This looks like being solution focused as opposed to, again, equality with everyone getting the same piece of the pie. And then what is the state of diversity, equity, inclusion currently? I think that this is very straightforward. I think that we already understand the implications of the demographics in the field of architecture. When we talked last time, I talked about how architecture was listed as one of 33 industries that was 90% white, technically 91.3% white. And as we look at new architects coming in, we actually have some promise in that about 20% of new architects identify as people of color, which is a boost from the past. It is up. And it is an indication that even though it's been slow, that efforts to make architecture more diverse and inclusive have been working, but slowly. And then as you can see here, the statistics are extremely low, particularly for Black and Latinx individuals. And so as we look at what equity looks like, it's going to be more resources, more efforts being poured into Black and Latinx communities. And so what is your current understanding, or what are your current feels about this situation? We're going to take a little bit of time to look at how, or check in with ourselves about how we feel when it comes to the issue of diversity. Before we get started, I want to ask you to first be open. As you enter your breakout rooms, I want you to really see it as a safe and brave space amongst your peers, where you can really talk about what this means. So the first question to consider: what does this lack of diversity look like in real life? What are the real life implications? How is it impacting your industry? And then also, how does it benefit you that it's not diverse? How does it work against you? And how do you feel about the lack of diversity? So we're going to go into breakout rooms, hopefully pretty small ones. Let's have about 7 minutes to discuss this. So you should have an invite. So I hope everyone is back. I hope those conversations were beneficial, and we're going to jump back into what it looks like to take on this challenge of becoming more diverse and more inclusive, and also bringing some equity into architecture and what that really looks like in real time. And so one of the things that was outlined in the diversity in the profession of architecture that came out in 2016 was, what are these barriers? What are the things that are in the way? Overwhelmingly, those fault lines of race, gender, and socioeconomic status were very clearly outlined. But when we look at the field overall, we're also lacking in professional development in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is creating this understanding that architecture is not where DEI work lies. Thinking about it more along the lines of retention and recruitment, as opposed to a culture change around what it really means to be diverse, what equity looks like within your field, and how to be inclusive. Other areas where there were real barriers were lack of concerted effort. And so the ability for membership organizations, for firms, industry leaders, and schools to work together. So concerted efforts to address systemic issues need to have all aspects of the system accountable and working together. Also, there was issue around retention and reentry. So how do you retain architects of color, women, and also when we look at those who are unable to stay connected, how do they get back into the field? How do you get back into the field after you've had a family? How do you get back into the field after you had an economic setback? And so reentry was another point of another fault line. And then the obvious, when it comes to pipeline, there's an issue of mentorship and sponsorship. This is mainly, the sponsorship is to address the cost of education and supplies. And the mentorship is to help people of color to navigate the system, and women. And then, of course, little knowledge of the field within communities of color. This is the one aspect that is very tied to the first session that we had, where we outlined historical trauma, how disenfranchised groups do not have the same access to education, the same worldview around what's possible for them based on the color of their skin or based on gender. And so these are your real barriers to DEI as you move forward on this work of becoming more diverse and equitable and inclusive. And so as you determine what steps are needed, these are your North Stars. How do you address these issues internally? When we talked before, we have outlined issues around systemic nature of racism and sexism. So this means that ecology matters. And so this is going to really look at systems and what systems need to be addressed. And so in our first session, we talked about this model, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who is actually a Russian child psychologist. And when he thought of this model, he was thinking about children who were not doing well in the education system. This is completely tied to any type of social or ecological issue. So in this case, he was thinking of education and education attainment. However, this can be applied to issues around racism, sexism, and any other social ail that we have, to include socioeconomic status as well. And so first we have to think about where we are in time and space. Right now, we are in, first, the collective trauma of a pandemic. We're also in a time where the history of slavery, genocide, the view of women as property has filtered down into all of our industries and all of our systems. And so this understanding that some groups should be upheld while others are oppressed stems from this larger system based on the time frame that we're in. Again, the age of equity is what we're in now. So there's a shift in this. There's going to be a shift in this sphere of influence regardless because of COVID-19. So we will begin to think about how we will create spaces as we address the pandemic. How do we work virtually? How do we, again, make spaces more safe when it comes to, even in design? How do we design spaces that are safe during a pandemic? We also need to think about this in terms of the next layer. So what are the beliefs and values that we have? When it comes to the field of architecture, obviously institutional racism is at play, and that is the reason for the discrepancies in the demographics. Right now, about 2% of architects are Black, with an even smaller 0.3% Black women, and that is a reflection of institutional racism. It's a reflection of a patriarchal system, and it also is a reflection of the beliefs and values that we have around particular groups, who we deem worthy to interact with, who we deem worthy of certain trades, who we trust, who we don't trust. This is from our beliefs and values that we have as a nation. And obviously, these are not always appropriate because, again, deeply embedded within our system is racism and sexism. And then this filters down to policies. In our last discussion, we talked about codes. We talked about urban planning. These are issues of policy, state issues, regional influences that are entrenched in racism and sexism that you're just not even aware of. When we think about this system, we have to think about redlining. The way that our cities are set up, what types of houses do people get? What types of loans do they get to build houses based on where they are in the city? Who gets the houses that have a certain aesthetic? What areas of town have a more institutional aesthetic to their buildings? Places where there is the need for social services. What do those buildings that house social services look like? What are those buildings that house nonprofits that serve people who are dealing with the impact of racism and sexism and oppression? What do they look like? And then of course the media and how we are represented and how media impacts how we see others. And so this system is probably one of the most powerful systems because this is where you will find the most resistance as you push for being more inclusive. You're going to push up against policies and procedures that are built around preventing that. And so this is going to be about changing those policies, incorporating trauma-informed policies, not just from the view of tokenism or quotas, but from the view of culture change and what it really means to create policies and procedures that are equitable. The mesosystem, this is an important system for the field when we are thinking about change, because in the exosystem and the mesosystem is where schools lie and academia. And so that is the battleground when it comes to equity in the field of architecture. Academia is your battleground. You are going to have to think about what it means to have children aspire to be architects, what it means for their college experience to be fulfilling and supported, who gets the appropriate internships, who gets job offers from schools job offers while they're still in college. What are the connections and networks that you have available, and how do they support people of color, and how do they support women? And so this is also neighborhoods, neighborhood homes, community centers. So this is also a place where your aesthetic can be used as a means to heal people. So in neighborhoods that are underserved, how can we create beautiful spaces for them? How can we create spaces of healing for them? And then, of course, the local issues. How do you create an aesthetic that addresses any type of local context, historical trauma within a space? How do you honor those who are present in that locality? Does their visual reflect them? Are you having aspects of architecture that bring in African influence, the influence of indigenous peoples, the influence of Latinx and the South America, Central America? How do you bring in that influence so that people can feel like their space around them resonates with their identity? And then, of course, the microsystem. This is going to be how you interact with your coworkers, stakeholders, clients. This is your one-on-one interactions. One of the main drivers for issues around retention is feeling as though you are a part of the team. Microaggressions in workplaces are one of the most poisonous ways to interact with people of color. It can make their work environment extremely hostile, and it is one of the main driving forces for high turnover when it comes to people of color in workplaces. And so microaggressions are just these small, everyday onslaughts that are reminding people of their otherness. And how do you interact with people of color? Are you honoring their experience? Are you listening? Are you validating? And this is the way to create a safe space in your one-on-one interactions where people feel comfortable and people feel included, and they're more likely to stay and they're more likely to be retained in their field. And so what really works? And so one of the things that we talked about last time was the white identity model, and how the last two were the highest levels, and what that meant was being anti-racist and pursuing social justice. On an individual level, that is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. But you need to be aware that your individual actions lives within systems. And so as we incorporate what we call trauma-informed practices, we're able to impact all levels of the systemic changes that we want to make. So trauma-informed practices, in our first session, I outlined the ACEs study, and I said that the root cause of most of the negative adversity that we have today when it comes around racism is based on historical trauma, the historical trauma of slavery, the historical trauma of genocide within the indigenous communities, and how since then that trauma has been a barrier for groups, even as there have been policies that have made things more possible in our country. And so trauma is one of the most insidious ways that our workplaces can become hostile. It also impacts how we interact with our environment. And so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration came out with a document quite some time now, I believe in the 90s, that outlined what it means to be trauma-informed. Usually when we think of trauma-informed, we've been thinking of, hospitals, or maybe even mental health companies and organizations, but really any organization should adopt trauma-informed practices as a way to make their employees and stakeholders feel at home, feel valued, and not be re-traumatized in their workplace and in their professional settings. And so obviously we're looking to realize that trauma is widespread, recognize what trauma looks like, respond by integrating knowledge of trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and then resist re-traumatizing people. All institutions really need to incorporate trauma-informed practices. However, architecture is uniquely situated in this because there is a new field that's called trauma-informed design. And so trauma-informed design is a really unique way to address trauma within people and organizations through art and expression to include architecture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. But these are the overarching principles: safety, trustworthiness, transparency, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues. These are the standouts within your field, especially safety. And of course, safety is physical and psychological. And then where these practices should be implemented in your governance, in your leadership, in the way that you write policy. Obviously, the physical environment. And then thinking about how you move forward, so progress monitoring, quality assurance, even in your financing and the evaluation of your work. So as you move forward on this journey around being more equitable, are you tracking it? Are you having the data to support your efforts? And then this visual we saw last time, it really gives a better understanding of what that looks like in your space. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about this visual, and then we'll have one last breakout to think through what it means for you individually to incorporate practices like these. So the two that really line up with your industry are going to be build beloved community and lead with love and justice. So this is being inclusive to serving groups, but not having them at the table. So if you want to build for a group, build for a neighborhood, build for a community, then how is their input involved? If you want to use art and expression as a way to heal communities, how is their input involved? It's not about doing something for people of color, it is about doing something with people of color. So power sharing, nothing about us without us. People having seats at the table. It is about cross collaboration. So working with other sectors to achieve common goals. Nonprofits are trying to serve communities. How can you help nonprofit organizations to do that within your field? One of those ways is trauma-informed design. How you can help those who are serving groups that are traumatized, communities of color, serving women. How can you help them to heal through your art? And then, of course, when we think about the one-on-one interactions, so much of that is going to be with your coworkers and your peers and your professional peers of color, honoring their resilience and fortitude. And that directly ties to collective liberation, which is going to be truth-telling, being very transparent about how we got here as an industry, telling the stories that are not always ending with the the good part of things, right? So when we talk about those first African-American architects, we talk about them as being overcomers, but we don't talk about the ways in which the white architects in the membership organizations and the firms at the time actively pushed back on their involvement. That's truth telling. It's not just saying, oh, this is the good story, but how did that actually play out? How were people of color really marginalized? How were they sabotaged? And we'll talk more about that in the third session when we do some case studies on those first people who were able to kind of break that ceiling. Trauma-informed design is going to be one of the ways, one of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to addressing issues of racial inequity within the field. Seeing your work as a way to heal people who will be in your spaces. And so these are trauma-informed design principles. And so I want to leave these last few minutes to have an open, quick discussion about what it means to incorporate these in real time. And here is one of the best options that I found online. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to be open to coming off mute and talk about your experiences in your discussions and also your takeaway from the different strategies that I've offered about what it means within your field to address diversity. So, like I said before, I'm a professor, so I'm great with the pause. What are your takeaways from this discussion today?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I guess on the question of how to address diversity is something I think about a lot as a person of color, and even how I identify myself is an issue. Like I'm Latino, am I Hispanic, all this stuff, so that's always another question. But as a person of color, I feel like there's a responsibility, but at the same time, I don't have the answers either. So it's not that easy, like how do I address diversity as a diverse person? It's not an easy thing to say, to answer or to lay out, but I guess as a individual to be open to to be more open about my experience, because I think my environment has affected growing up how I see the built environment. So I would like to add to that, to our collective knowledge as designers. So to me, that's important.
Yeah, that's great. So sharing experiences is a great way as an individual to impact the larger industry and the larger field.
Ingrid, this is Michael. I work in Memphis, and this is something, you mentioned something in your last couple of slides that we talked about in our breakout room earlier, which was representation at the table for minorities, especially when you're designing spaces for them. So being an architect in Memphis, the city is a majority African-American city. So one thing that I find that's impacting the profession is the lack of representation in professional staff in our firm does not, it's a gap in knowledge and a gap of perspective for what we're designing for our clients. So that's one thing that I think that one way that our profession can improve is, I like the phrase that you said, nothing about us without us. We need to encourage people to come to the table, to learn from them. So we can do it both ways. We need to obviously increase diversity in our profession, but we also need to increase participation from the communities we're designing in, so that we make sure all those perspectives are represented. and we can represent those qualities in the spaces that you were talking about.
Yes, that's perfect, because I mean, even just the aesthetic itself, it's mostly European, mostly ancient Greek. And so, you know, if you are working with African Americans or in a space, you need to think about how they see themselves in their space. Do they see African influences? Do they see a Native American influence? So yes, thank you so much, Mr. Winner.
Thank you.
I think similar to, or to kind of tag on what Michael said, I think for us as design professionals, recognizing that there's already so many community groups and organizations and nonprofits that are actively working in, have long been engaged with, are serving, and are very much a part of these communities who have needs or desires that we don't know about, and engaging with them and letting them tell us what the community needs and wants, and rather than us trying to identify and go in and be like, we don't know what these communities need, and there's people that are working with them, and we can ask, make ourselves available, say we want to be a part of this, we want to make our services available to you, and yeah, let the communities tell us what they need.
Yes, and this is a very important aspect of equity, because it really gets down to that whole white supremacist worldview, which is that I know what's best for people of color, right? It puts you in the space of the authority. I know what people need. And that is, even when it comes from a good place, it comes off as disingenuous, because it's a very different experience, and it also infantilizes groups. And so they need to be involved, and they can be involved, especially as we are able to break down the barriers that make it hard for them to be involved. So one of the things about elitism and how it upholds white supremacy is through language. And so if you don't say the right words, you can't talk to me. If you don't speak the right way, we can't talk. But at the end of the day, this is just another reflection of white supremacy and the ways in which groups have been denied access based on the rules of the larger mainstream society. This doesn't have to be this way, but it is a tool in which to exclude others. And so how are we making it easy for people to come to the table and share their experiences?
Ingrid, it's Jeannie. And I think in addition to that, and it goes along with the language, I think it's Brene Brown that tell me more. So we may be using the same words, but they may not mean the same thing. And so trying to get to the root of, well, what does that mean to you? What kind of impact are you looking for, and how do you envision that impact happening?
Yes.
And having those conversations.
That's a perfect example. So yes, even with language, sometimes we say the same words and don't mean the same things, especially in systems approach. When we talk about systems approach, often, to me, I'm saying the system is broken, and therefore it is breaking people. But other people say systems approach and believe that the system is working well, and that the system is trying to fix broken people. And so even when we say the same words, we might not always mean the same things.
So in our communities and in our profession as well, I think it's the benefit, and what we're talking about today, the benefit of diversity is that you have that diversity of thought, diversity of perception. We see a lot of time failures on different boards of directors, different things. Like you ask a question like, how did this even get out? How was this published? Without having that diversity of thought and oversight, of opinions, saying, hey, this is not going to go well with Black people. This is not going to go well with, and explain why. So I think that level of education in our groups, as well as in our workplaces, when we go out to the communities, and when we go out there, we want to look like our communities. So you don't want to engage with the community and not look like them. And then they are looking at us like, okay, this is not for me. You know, this profession is not for me because I don't see anybody represented, you know, in it that looks like me. So it's not for me. And that's with children especially, that comes off very, very much because they are visual, and they relate visually. So we need to be able to write that narrative, you know, frame that narrative for them that it is attainable to them. And then we need to understand, you know, as well, how these systems have broken us and created this problem where you have, you know, less than, the percentages that we have, you know, in representation, less than, 3% Black, and, the 3% of Black women. So why is that? And then you have to look and you have to ask us, you know, what was your experience growing up and how did it affect you getting licensed? I did a Pachacacha like recently. It was titled Becoming a Unicorn. And it kind of went through, it just like went over my life and how I got to where I am now, you know, as being a licensed architect. And after I did the presentation, when I was working through it, I actually had to come up with a subtitle, and that was How Systemic Racism Influenced My Life. Because even me telling that story, I started to see, I was like, wow, you know, this really did happen. My parents lived in North Nashville. They lived in a red line neighborhood. They could not get home loans because of it. And then we had to live in the projects. And then just, you know, living in the projects and living in a red line neighborhood, I went to schools that weren't really desegregated. You know, my schools were segregated. We didn't, you know, I could see the deferred maintenance, you know, within my school system. I saw the lack of programming that we had. And it wasn't until we had to leave because of, you know, some issues with our neighbors and everything that we moved out to the suburbs of Mount Juliet, that I was able to have access to more programming and different things like that. So I actually saw these things happening. And even when I was in school, you know, being the only, and we kind of talked about that in our group, that when you are the only, you don't have the benefit of anonymity. You don't have the benefit of being anonymous. Whenever you walk into the room, you're representing your whole race, or you're representing your gender, and you're not, you know, necessarily representing yourself, because that's going to be projected onto you. And it kind of reminds me of the allostatic stress that you were talking about last week, Ingrid. You know, that's a lot of stress on you when you have the whole, you know, your whole race on your shoulders when you come in a room, because all eyes are on you, and you feel like you have to project that. So when we get to a point to where we are not, you know, the onlys, I think, you know, some of that will disappear. And that stress, those stress levels will level out. But I feel like this is a problem that we've created as a society. So we have to be very much proactive in rectifying it. It's not going to go away by itself. So we have to get out there and do the work. And sometimes that's going to cost something. And then if you think about things in the past, that the humps that we've gotten over as far as voting rights, and even, you know, the ability to sit at lunch counters, not having to go through back doors to restaurants and different things like that, that didn't cost anybody anything. You know, it didn't cost anybody anything to, you know, for me to have the right to vote. Didn't cost anybody anything for me to be able to go into a restaurant and eat. As a matter of fact, they got more money because of it. So what you know, there are things that we have to do now that may cost you as a firm, you know, that you won't see the immediate benefits, because you have to dig down now and grow that pool that we don't have in representation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had a couple of questions too. That how much time do we have, Ingrid? Is this about?
I've been a very bad steward of time today.
Okay.
So we are over time.
Okay.
So, and I want you to get your questions, especially if you can put them in the chat too. But I do also want to say that the next session will be all interaction. So it will be the majority of the time we'll have at least an hour for discussion. And I also want to talk a little bit about the things that you brought up, Valerie, that stood out for me. First, we definitely need to think about that multi-sector work. So even on boards, on your board, you should have someone who understands trauma. You should have a psychologist or a social worker or someone in the nonprofit represented, so that it's not just this one insulated perspective. Because there's so much outside of architecture that is impacted by architecture, but also is influenced.
I'm disappointed.
Architecture influences that, and vice versa. So it's reciprocal interactions. And if you are only thinking about your industry, then that can be a missed opportunity to be more well-rounded and to serve the community in a more real way. So I'm going to hand it over to Linda to close us out, and I will see you guys hopefully next week.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to all the attendees and AIA Tennessee, NOMA Nashville, and NOMA Memphis for putting this program together. Remember to put your name and your AIA number in the chat box if you want credit for this. And the next and last talk in this series will be October 13th at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. So mark that down on your calendars. And thank you again, and we'll see you then. Thank you.